Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. This is Professor Joseph Holbrook with another episode of Modern American History. Today we're starting around 1920 with the Roaring Twenties. Our book chapter is Modern Life, and this covers the period of time between World War I and the Great Depression. So without further ado, let's jump right into the material. So here's a classic picture representing the Roaring Twenties, a time of excitement and change up through 1932 and the depths of the Great Depression and the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Modern times. And some highlights of this period of time. The Eighth Amendment opposed prohibition, a big mistake. Warren G. Harding was elected president. The census revealed a major shift of people moving from farms to cities. That shift continued on. I was one of the last people to grow up on a farm. I would suppose that I was born in 1951 and left the farm about 18 years later. And there was also So let's look at the economic recession, 1920 through 1921. Again, one of the themes that I talk about in modern American history is that there's numerous recessions and numerous depressions happening on the scale of every 10 to 20 years. That's something you can take away from this class and prepare for the next great recession or depression, as it will come. Legislation passed in 1921 to assist maternal care. There was a Washington conference leading to naval disarmament. Record economic growth. Automobile age begins. T.S. Eliot published The Wasteland in 1922, which basically goes into the wasteland is the 20th century, a period of desolation, a period of tragedy with World War I. That was even before the Great Depression and World War II. It's a classic poem. 1923, President Harding died, succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, who was his vice president. Coolidge had been governor of Massachusetts. There's a famous anecdote about Coolidge. He was known as a man of few words, and when he was at a state dinner, a lady was seated next to him, and she said, "President Coolidge, someone dared me, and I made a bet with me that I couldn't get you to say more than 2 words." And Calvin Coolidge looked at her coolly and said, "You lose." Time magazine was founded. The Dawes Plan reduces German reparations. There was a scandal called the Teapot Dome. U.S. troops withdraw from the Dominican Republic. And the National Origin Act limits immigration. The perennial xenophobia of the United States. F. Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby. And the height of the Klu Klux Klan's power was 1925. The Scopes trial over free speech and the teaching of science. That was the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. The first talkies and movie industry. Charles Lindbergh's solo flight. Herbert Hoover was elected president. We'll talk a little bit more about Charles Lindbergh. The Kellogg-Briand Pact condemned militarism. Ernest Hemingway published A Farewell to Arms in 1929. If you've been to Key West, perhaps you've been to the Hemingway house. Okay, so what else here? Let's skip over some of this. Miners' strike in Harlan County, Kentucky. Harlan County, Kentucky at one time was the murder capital of the world. Bonus Army rebuffed in Washington. We'll talk more about that. The Bonus Army were World War I veterans who had been promised a bonus for their service in World War I, and in the height of the Great Depression, they were asking Congress to give them their bonus, and that's a very sad story. So, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected in 1932. So from there, we'll move on. There's some more fingers pointing. So here's a picture of Charles Lindbergh. He was a hero of the 1920s. He was the first man to fly an airplane across the Atlantic Ocean. Charles Lindbergh, he's played in a movie. He flew across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. A movie was made about his life in 1957, starring Jimmy Stewart. Very good movie, by the way. I have a DVD of it. And let me play a little bit of the trailer for you. Let's see if this will work. I'm going to try it. Here it is.
I am running to be president of the United
Oh
States.
no, I'm sorry.
With me in this
How do I get rid of
so
this?
I'm asking you to pitch in.
I wasn't expecting that.
The world held its breath, and then these pages herald one of the most incredible feats in the annals of human endeavor. The dramatic triumph of mind, body, and spirit against all odds, of Charles Lindbergh and the spirit of St. Louis. But equally dramatic is the personal story that takes you into the heart, yes, into the soul of a man. Here are his dreams, his fears, his defeats, his victories. Here too are people, each important, vitally important to this story of a man who kept a rendezvous with the destiny of the world.
So, if you want to some extra credit, you can, I highly recommend that movie, Spirit of St. Louis. It gives you a flavor of what the 1920s were like. 1957 was when the movie was made with Jimmy Stewart. And in 2003, some of the illegitimate children of Charles Lindbergh came forth in 2003 to announce that their father was Charles Lindbergh by a secret lover. He had one wife and 6 kids. His oldest baby was kidnapped, the Lindbergh kidnapping, and the baby was murdered. It was called the crime of the century. He and his wife were considered to be like an ideal couple, but in 2003 it was discovered he had 4 other mistresses and he had 7 children out of wedlock. So a lot of secrets about the man that was not revealed in the movie, but I highly recommend the movie nonetheless. So moving right along, here is a picture of the United States, and you see the little red star or explosion is where there was Klu Klux Klan violence. Wherever you see a triangle, the U.S. Senator was elected with Klan support, and wherever you see a little blue circle, a governor was elected with Klan support. So in 1925, the Klu Klux Klan was at an all-time high in its all-time peak in its popularity and influence in the United States. The United Fruit Company became a dominant company that invested in South America in the 1920s. You see here a picture of bananas. To boost the sales, the company published elaborate color advertisements. Bananas were sufficiently exotic to explain to consumers how to tell when the bananas were ripe. Unfortunately, also, if you study Latin American history, the United Fruit Company was responsible for a good deal of interference with countries such as Nicaragua, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, where they bought up land and they interfered with the local governments to get preference for their business activities. If you've read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's famous book, 100 Years of Solitude, you'll see a whole section near the end of the book about bananas being grown on the coast of Colombia and a massacre of 2,000 people. So the United Fruit Company was somewhat of a nefarious influence to our neighbors of the South. And in the 1920s, Americans bought magazines like Photoplay to learn about the stars of their favorite entertainment media and movies. Advertisers took advantage of the broad audience to promote a wide range of consumer goods and services to men and women. This is also a period of time in which Henry Ford's development of mass production techniques gave Americans a high standard of living, plus the inexpensive availability of automobiles and other consumer goods. So, moving right along, so I don't miss some of my stuff here. In the 1920s, there was a partnership between government and business that expanded throughout the 1920s. The nation's prosperity seemed to confirm the wisdom of allowing corporate interests to manage economic life. Middle-class Americans respected business leaders as esteemed public officials. The Republicans were led by the conservative pro-business wing of the party, and they chose Warren G. Harding in 1920 as their presidential candidate. His vice president was Calvin Coolidge. Harding promised not heroics, but healing. On election day, he won in a landslide, starting a Republican dominance that lasted till 1932. That's a 12-year period. Harding was not impressive, but he was a pliable candidate, genial, loyal, and mediocre. Most active member of the administration was Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce. So in 1923, Harding died suddenly of a heart attack, and Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the president. He was an austere, unimpeachably moral New England Yankee, and I've already mentioned to you that he was a man of few words. He favored isolationism and foreign policy. In the 1924 elections, the Democrats disagreed mightily over prohibition, immigration, and restriction of immigration, and the growing power of the racist Klu Klux Klan. This resulted in a hopeless deadlock between Governor Al Smith, New York, and William McAdoo of California. After 103 ballots, the compromise candidate was John W. Davis, a Wall Street lawyer, probably leading to their defeat in the election of 1924. A third-party challenge was mounted in 1924 by Senator Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin. We've talked about him before. He was a progressive candidate in Wisconsin. He mobilized farmers, reformers, and labor leaders. He favored the nationalization of railroads, public ownership of utilities, and constitutional amendment to allow Congress to override the Supreme Court. And because of the divisions among the Democrats, Republicans won in a landslide. And sitting President Calvin Coolidge received 15.7 million votes to Davis, who was the Democratic candidate, 8.4 million. La Follette's 4.9 million. You can see that if La Follette's 5 million were added to Davis's 8.4 million, it would have still been a little short of the vote tally of Calvin Coolidge. There was a significant drop in voting among men. Women received suffrage in 1920, suffrage meaning the right to vote. Al Smith and Robert Wagner were developing a social welfare agenda in New York. So, let's talk about corporate capitalism. The revolution in business management that began in the 1890s finally triumphed in the 1920s. Remember, we talked about scientific management. Large-scale corporate bureaucracies headed by the chief executive officers, CEOs. This immediately after the World War I, the nation experienced a series of economic shocks. There was rampant inflation in 1919, and then came a sharp 2-year recession. And as I've said before, if you take nothing else away from modern American history, take away the fact that there are regular recessions in a regular pattern in the capitalistic economic system. You should be saving money and preparing for the next one. An abundance of new consumer products such as the automobile stimulated economic expansion. Scientific management had been introduced by Frederick W. Taylor in 1895, but it was widely implemented by 1920. This was a soul-crushing approach to business management that treated the assembly line workers as machines, basically, doing repetitive labor for 8 hours, no creativity, no individuality, and easily replaceable. The economy had some significant weaknesses during this period, especially agriculture, which employed 1/4 of all workers, which never recovered from the post-war recession. The price of wheat dropped by 40%, corn by 32%, the price of hogs by 50%. The farmer's national share of income dropped from 16% in 1919 to 9% in 1929. This was about the time period when my grandparents left eastern Kentucky, which was not a good farming area because it was very hilly, and they moved their entire family to Ohio where they could find better farming land and perhaps better opportunities for farming. Weakness of coal mining and textile, agricultural sectors in the economy foreshadowed economic problems that would help to cause the Great Depression. These businesses had overexpanded during the war and now faced overcapacity and falling prices. And we've already talked about bananas. Also, welfare capitalism arose in 1920s. It was a system of management that stressed responsibility for employees' well-being. A good thing. General Electric, U.S. Steel, and other large corporations offered their workers health insurance, old age pensions, and the opportunity to buy stock at a discount. Their goal was to create loyal and long-serving workforce. Welfare capitalism also had a secondary goal of deterring workers from joining labor unions. Decisions by the conservative Supreme Court undercut union activism and government regulation of the labor market. Also, there was a need for new consumers during this period. This in U.S. Latin American relations. This is called a period of gunboat diplomacy. There was a need for expansion of consumers to buy U.S. products. So General Electric set up factories in Latin America, China, Japan, Australia. General Motors expanded sales in Europe. Swift, Armour, and Wilson set up meatpacking plants in Argentina. The United Fruit Company developed lands and sources of banana cultivation in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala. And Standard Oil acquired oil reserves in Mexico and Venezuela. This was a period also of economic nationalism, with the outflow of U.S. capital slowing, then stopping. This undermined reparation payments. The stock market crash also increased the policy of economic nationalism, resulting in the Hawley-Smoot Act of 1930, raising tariffs to an all-time high. In a period right now where there's a return to economic nationalism. At least on the Republican side, there's a lot of talk about tariffs with China, and this goes against the neoliberal policies of since the 1990s, that popularized by the Reagan trickle-down philosophy that removing tariffs, removing regulations, lowering taxes would create additional prosperity. So this Hawley-Smoot Act of 1930 made it almost impossible for the Allied powers to pay off the remaining $4.3 billion in war loans. American foreign policy in the 20s and 30s was both isolationist and interventionist. It was isolationist in the sense of refusing to join the League of Nations and the Court of International Justice, but it was interventionist with the Dawes Plan and a vigorous internationalist economic policy. And Latin America and the Caribbean held a considerable amount of U.S. investments, and this was accompanied by a number of occupations in the Caribbean. Occupation of the Dominican Republic, the 16-year occupation of Nicaragua by U.S. Marines. There was one more. It wasn't Honduras. Where was the other one? Nicaragua. Haiti. Haiti was occupied for almost 30 years, I believe, by U.S. Marines. And in all three cases, it debilitated democracy in those three countries. Here it is. To defend the U.S. interests and quell civil unrest, the U.S. stationed troops in the Dominican Republic for 8 years, from 1916 to 1924. In Nicaragua for 21 years, 1912 to 1933. In Nicaragua, there was a liberal political leader, military leader, who fought against the U.S. Marines when they were stationed there, named Augusto Sandino, and he was viewed as a freedom fighter against U.S. Marines. And so later, when there was a revolution against Somoza in 1979, the revolutionary group called themselves the Sandinistas, after Augusto Sandino. Pardon. In Haiti, U.S. Marines were stationed for 19 years, beginning in 1915 to 1934. All of these kind of coincide with the period from Woodrow Wilson through the early Depression years and the rise of Franklin Roosevelt. And this involved gunboat diplomacy, which was an attempt to foster and encourage U.S. businesses through intimidation of weaker nations. There was also considerable tension with Mexico when it nationalized its oil under Lorenzo Cárdenas, which had repercussions with Standard Oil. 1921, the Washington Naval Arms Conference won acceptance of a plan that placed strict limits on naval expansion. This was during a time the U.S. was maintaining its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, although the U.S. also concurrently reduced its commitments in East Asia and Europe. In 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Plan condemned all militarism, but provided no enforcement mechanism. So it was like an international kiss. In other words, it didn't mean anything. Okay, let's talk about a new national culture during the 1920s. This marked the development of a mass national culture, something new in history, because regional and local cultures have been more predominant in the 19th century because of communications and limitations of travel. But in the 1920s, now you have the opportunity with the radio, newspapers, with air travel. You had the possibility of a more national mass culture, emphasizing leisure, consumption, and amusement. Automobiles, paved roads, the postal service, movies, radios, telephones, magazines, chain stores all took the center stage. Let's think of a contemporary example. Where can you go in the United States without finding a McDonald's on the corner? And on the other corner, a Starbucks. And nearby, there will be a Walmart. That's what they're talking about a mass national culture. And of course, it's only gotten more so in the years since, almost a century since. This culture linked Americans in diverse classes and regions to an expanding web of national experience. In homes across the country in the 1920s, Americans sat down to the Kellogg's cornflakes and toast made with a General Electric toaster. They drove around in a Ford Model T to go to Safeway, A&P, or Woolworths. In the evening, the family sat down to listen to the radio programs or listen to the latest issue or read the latest issue of the Reader's Digest. On weekends, they might see a Charlie Chaplin film in the local theater. millions shared similar cultural experiences. You can see how this would facilitate the rise of a homogeneous national culture in some ways. So that we have to ask ourselves, why is that no longer the case? Why is our culture today so fragmented? Which the McDonald's and the Starbucks is a counterexample, but perhaps because of the role of social media, cable TV, it's a very different situation today. This was a consumer society that was emerging. Nevertheless, it's important, as the book points out, that many black, rural, working-class Americans were unable to participate in the new national consumer culture. There was an unequal distribution of income, limiting many consumers' ability to buy new products. The bottom 40% of American families had an average income of only $725, which is about $8,000 today. That's not very much. Poverty in the 1920s prevented many people from participating fully in the commercial mass culture. And this takes us back to here. In the 1920s, Americans bought magazines like Photoplay to learn about the stars of their new favorite entertainment media, the movies. Advertisers took advantage of this broad audience to promote a wide range of consumer goods and services to both men and women. And you see several examples there of advertisements. So another source of consumer profit was, not consumer profit, but corporate profit, was housewives and credit. In order to make consumer culture widely available, even to those with limited incomes, a newly devised installment plans allowed people to purchase cars, radios, and sewing machines on time. Buy now, pay later. New appliances had a dramatic impact on women's lives. Electric appliances made housewives' chores easier and encouraged middle-class housewives to do their own housework and laundry instead of having to themselves. During the 1920s, the National Women's Party fought for the expansion of women's rights after women's suffrage had been secured by the 19th Amendment in 1920. If you remember, the National Women's Party was founded by Alice Paul, a Quaker woman with a PhD in political science. They organized private events like the Tea Party, pictured here in 1923, and waged public campaigns such as the introduction of the Equal Rights Amendment to Congress as they continued the struggle for equality. Necessities or luxuries. In order to encourage consumption, a new field of advertising developed around 1929. The advertising industry focused around New York City's Madison Avenue. Consumers were not passive victims of a manipulative advertising agencies, but were willing participants in a new national culture. Many middle-class Americans, gratification of personal desires became a key measure of self-worth. One aspect of this is the new automobile culture, the showpiece of modern consumer capitalism, and revolutionized American economic and social life. There was mass production of cars, stimulated by the prosperity of the 1920s. Ford workers went from producing one car in 12 hours in 1913 to producing one car in 93 minutes by 1927. By 1927, Ford was producing one car every 24 seconds. That's from one car in 12 hours in 1913 to one car every 24 seconds in 1927. Pretty dramatic. So this is a side view of a Ford sedan with 4 passengers and a woman getting in on the driver's side. 1923. So, along with the auto industry, came a stimulation of steel, petroleum, chemical, rubber, and glass industries in order to provide the raw materials to build cars. It provided 3.7 jobs for 3.7 million workers. It also amped up highway construction as a billion-dollar business. Car ownership broke down the rural isolation because it was now possible in a small town to drive to the big city. 1924, the first suburban shopping center was opened in Kansas City called the Country Club Plaza. First suburban shopping center, 1924. Now you have shopping malls that are becoming quickly obsolete. I wonder what they will become with the possibility of buying items through Amazon online and other sources. It's becoming increasingly obsolete to go to shopping malls, even dangerous. In our shopping mall near our house here in Columbia, Maryland, there was a shooting the other day that took someone's life, and this is becoming increasingly common in shopping malls, Walmarts, other public venues. So this will probably encourage a continued flight away from public shopping malls. Here is a picture. We're talking about the flappers. Clara Bow is an example of a 1920s Roaring Twenties girl makeup, short skirts and smoking and jazz. Clara Bow. There's another picture of this new breed of women, the flappers, challenging traditional expectations of women by bobbing their hair, wearing short dresses, flouting social and sexual norms. These behaviors reinforce stereotypes, gender stereotypes that were not so positive. And here's another one. Oops. There we go. The frivolity, decadence, and obliviousness of the 1920s was embodied in the image of the flapper, the stereotype of the carefree and indulgent woman of the Roaring Twenties. This is a drawing by Russell Patterson in the library. Mary Pickford had a film persona capturing the glamorous and lavish lifestyle desired by female moviegoers of the 1920s. So this brings us to the jazz singers. There was a talking movie called The Jazz Singer, which was the first movie with audio soundtrack. Jazz music captured the sensibility of the 1920s, especially creativity and sensuality. It was an African-American art form. Most of the early jazz musicians were black, and they carried its rhythms to Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. Jazz often expressed black descent and became popular with young intellectuals. And here it shows a phonograph machine expanding the popularity of jazz, which can now be heard at home as well as in a city jazz joint. Crazy Blues by Mamie Smith and her Jazz Hound sold 1 million records in 1920. By the 1950s, black music had become American music. Perry Bradford was also the composer of Little Richard's Keep Knockin' in 1957. This also coincided with mass circulation of magazines and also the radio, key factors in the creation of a national culture. In 1922, there were 10 magazines, each claimed a circulation of 2.5 million. Time magazine, Saturday Evening Post, the Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping were just a few of those, along with the Associated Press and the United Press. So this brings us to another section, the redefining of American identity. This is a period in which there was a rise in black consciousness. One manifestation was Garveyism, which most white and black Americans considered to be too radical. Nevertheless, it cultivated a substantial following and stimulated later black nationalistic movements. Marcus Garvey advocated, in some ways, a return to Africa and a strong emphasis on black pride, Ethiopianism. So this was happening at the same time that there was a rise in the Klu Klux Klan and racial tensions. Also, the Klu Klux Klan was violently prejudiced against Catholic and Jewish immigrants, as well as African Americans. This created considerable tension. There was a flourishing may not be the best word, but there was a spread of race riots in northern cities that accompanied the black migration out of the South into the northern cities, where they were competing for jobs against local residents, and the lynchings in the South. 6 million people left the farms for the cities in the 1920s. Nearly 4 million were African Americans from the South. There was also a rise in nativism or xenophobia. White Protestants were suspicious of Catholic immigrants, African Americans, Irish Catholics, Jewish. There was, this is a sign here of the Ku Klux Klan, patriotic Protestant nativism. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1960s and 1870s stood for the cause of the Confederate nationalism and white racism, but the new Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s embraced values of American patriotism and Protestantism. It believed that neither Catholics nor Jews could be real Americans. And there's also a rise of immigration. Let me back up. Attempts to limit immigration. Congress banned Chinese immigration in 1882. In 1907, Roosevelt negotiated an agreement to restrict Japanese immigration. 1924, Congress passed a National Origins Act. 1929, Congress passed more restricted quotas, setting a cap of 150,000 immigrants per year from Europe and banning immigration from most of Asia. 1 million Mexicans entered the United States from 1900 to 1930, partly because of the violence and upheaval of the Mexican Revolution. American employers, large farmers in Texas and California, persuaded Congress to allow Mexicans to come and as a form of cheap labor. And there are other values conflicts going on. The whole cultural war thing is not new. It's not just from the 1990s, early 2000s, but it goes all the way back to the 1920s. There was a rise of fundamentalism, emphasizing literal reading of the Bible, which clashed with modernists over science in the Bible. There was revivalism with Billy Sunday and Amy Semple McPherson, used open-air revivals to popularize their brand of Christianity. And there was this famous Scopes monkey trial, which was a religious controversy over the idea of evolution. Fundamentalists wrote their beliefs into law in Tennessee, making it illegal to teach evolution. This resulted in what was called by the media the Scopes monkey trial, where a young high school teacher of science taught evolution and was arrested and charged with breaking the state law, and led to a trial that was covered by the media and ended with fundamentalist Christians being ridiculed in the public eye as being backward and anti-science. Clarence Darrow defended Scopes, and William Jennings Bryan, a former presidential candidate, spoke for the prosecution and for fundamentalist Christians. Clarence Darrow, sitting on the right, basically mocked and savaged the idea of a literal interpretation of the Bible and made fun of William Jennings Bryan for being very backward. This is an example of Amy Semple McPherson, who was the founder of the Foursquare Church. The Foursquare Church is a Pentecostal church which claims a worldwide membership of 3 million people. She was born in Ontario, Canada, married a missionary, Robert Semple. After his death in China, she married Harold McPherson and eventually settled in Los Angeles. And by 1923, she was preaching to a radio audience and to crowds of 5,000 in her Angeles temple. The media bias. H.L. Mencken of the Baltimore Sun wrote, trial reports were heavily slanted. We're now back talking about the Scopes Monkey trial. He mocked the town's inhabitants as yokels and morons. He called Bryan a buffoon, and his speeches were theologic bilge. In contrast, he called the defense eloquent and magnificent. This might be kind of a preview of 2016 and the description of conservative Americans as a basket of deplorables. To some extent, our political conflicts over the last 8 years, I guess it has been, is somewhat of a class struggle between lower class, less educated people and the upper classes and the elites. And it's a complex subject which I will not go into any further. Election of 1928, Alfred E. Smith of New York, who was the first Irish Catholic to run for president, I think he ran against Calvin Coolidge and lost the election. No, it was Herbert Hoover, I'm sorry. So Herbert Hoover won 444 electoral votes to Alfred Smith's 87, and 58% of the popular vote to 40% of the Democrats' vote. And so here you have another picture of Klux Klan. They were very predominant in this time period. We didn't talk at all about Prohibition. Skip over that. Going back to the election of Alfred Smith, the election between Herbert Hoover and Alfred Smith. Smith had a heavy New York accent. He wore a brown derby, which emphasized a working class background. The Republican candidate was Herbert Hoover, an administrator and an engineer. And the issue was Catholicism versus Protestantism, pluralism, alcohol, and prohibition and criminality. Those are some of the issues of the day. So you see the photo here of a Klu Klux Klan rally inducting some new members. It was taken by a popular news photographers Underwood and Underwood, showing a gathering of 300 Ku Klux Klansmen outside Washington to initiate a group of men into their order. And that brings us up to the Great Depression, which will be continued in our next session. I'm sorry we went a little bit long in this video, but there's a lot to cover in American history. So next week we will discuss the Great Depression, beginning with Herbert Hoover's role and then continuing with the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. After that, we will then enter into discussion of World War II. Then we get into the Cold War in the 50s and the part of American history that I remember. I remember about half of the 20th century. So I'll be your primary source when we get to that part. Nice to see you. Take care. Have a great rest of your summer. I'll talk to you later.